All right, so let's dive right in. We're taking a deep dive today into the conflict in Ukraine, and specifically some potential paths to peace, or at least how different people are talking about peace.
Yeah, lots of different perspectives flying around out there.
Exactly. We got a few interesting sources to unpack today. We've got some articles, one from Breitbart and one from Military Watch.
All right.
And we also found this really interesting social media post attributed to President Trump.
All right. Sounds like a good mix.
Yeah. And the reason we thought this would make for a good deep dive is that all of this is kind of swirling around these U.S.-Russia peace talks, which, have begun, but, and this is a big but, without Ukraine at the table.
Yeah, that's definitely raised some eyebrows. A lot of people are questioning, Zelensky's leadership and whether Ukraine should be holding new elections.
Right. And that's actually where the Breitbart article comes in. So Breitbart is reporting that Trump suggested that, he used the term price of peace, that maybe Ukraine holding fresh elections should be part of these U.S.-Russia negotiations.
Interesting. I mean, it certainly feeds into that narrative that Russia has been pushing, right? That the current Ukrainian government isn't legitimate.
You mean because Zelensky postponed elections last year?
Exactly, under martial law, which, is understandable in a wartime situation, but it does raise questions about the democratic process. And
Trump, he even said something like, wouldn't the people of Ukraine have to say, it's been a long time since we've had an election? That's not a Russia thing, he said. That's coming from me and coming from a lot of other countries, too.
I bet that went down well in Kyiv.
Well, yeah, about that. The article goes on to say that Ukrainian state media and Zelensky himself, they came out pretty strongly against Trump's statement.
I can imagine.
Yeah, they accused him of spreading Russian disinformation. And of course, their argument is that, holding elections in the middle of a war is basically impossible. And they're pointing to Zelensky's approval ratings, which are, relatively high, as proof that he's still the legitimate leader.
Okay, I can see their point, but it is kind of tricky, right? I mean, how could they even have elections right now with martial law? Opposition parties are banned. And millions of Ukrainians are living abroad as refugees.
Yeah, logistically, it seems like a nightmare.
Yeah, and we have to remember the political situation before the war, too. Ukraine's parliament, they had several pro-Russian parties, and allowing those parties to campaign freely now, potentially even with Russian backing, is that's a whole other can of worms. It raises serious questions about, how free and fair any election could actually be under those circumstances.
Right. And it's not just the election comments that are getting attention. Trump also has some things to say about Ukraine's role in the whole conflict in the first place.
Oh, really? What did he say?
Well, some outlets are focusing on this statement where he said that Ukraine could have maybe prevented the war.
Prevented it? How?
By making a deal with Russia. Yeah. I've got the quote here. He said, "You could have made a deal. I could have made a deal with Ukraine that would have given them almost all of the land, everything, and no people would have been killed and no city would have been demolished."
Wow. Okay, so that statement is definitely going to generate some debate. On the one hand, it's heartbreaking to think about the loss of life and the destruction that's happened. But on the other hand, it's kind of it feels like an oversimplification of a really complex situation,
Yeah, for sure. And, this also brings up those reports from back in 2022 about Ukraine actually refusing peace talks.
Oh, right. The ones where they were supposedly influenced by the UK to keep fighting. Yeah. I remember those reports suggested that that Boris Johnson, who was the UK prime minister at the time, that he had a pretty big influence on Ukraine's decision to reject those negotiations, although, of course, Ukraine denied those claims. But does make you wonder about the role that that outside powers have played in shaping how this whole conflict is played out.
Yeah, absolutely. And then there's this Military Watch article, which focuses on Trump's, his use of the word dictator to describe Zelensky.
Dictator. That's a pretty loaded term.
Right. It's definitely gotten a lot of people talking.
I can imagine. So what's the context there?
Well, the article kind of delves into this whole idea of a wartime dictator, like how in times of war, leaders are often granted these emergency powers to maintain order and security. But then those powers can sometimes be used to suppress dissent and basically erode democratic processes.
Yeah, it's that classic tension between, national security and democratic values. And it's never an easy balance to strike.
Especially in a situation like this where the stakes are so high.
Right. And it's interesting to think about, Zelensky's decision to postpone the elections in light of that. I mean, it might have been necessary at the time, but it does raise some concerns about the potential long-term impact on Ukraine's democracy.
Definitely. And, that postponement combined with the ban on opposition parties, it creates this environment where dissent is basically stifled and alternative viewpoints are, they're kind of pushed to the margins. So it's important to really examine whether those measures were truly necessary, for the war effort, or if they represent a more concerning shift towards authoritarianism.
Absolutely. And, this is something we see throughout history, right? The way that wartime can be used to justify actions that would be unacceptable in peacetime.
Yeah, it's a slippery slope, and it's something that we need to be very mindful of, especially when we're talking about, a conflict that's so closely tied to these fundamental ideas of freedom and democracy. But speaking of Trump, he didn't exactly hold back on Truth Social, on his social media platform.
Yeah. What did he say?
Well, he specifically mentioned Zelensky's approval ratings, the ones that Zelensky's people were touting as proof of his legitimacy.
Yeah.
Well, Trump is claiming they're actually really low. Yeah. And he also accused Zelensky of mismanaging the funds that he's getting from Western allies.
Okay, so he's really going after Zelensky here.
Yeah, pretty hard. In fact, in his post, he even said that Zelensky refuses to hold elections. His ratings in Ukrainian polls are very low, and the only thing he has succeeded in is playing Biden like a violin.
Wow. That's quite the statement. It seems like he's really trying to paint a picture of Zelensky as, I don't know, as a leader who's more concerned with personal gain than with the well-being of his people.
Right. And then he went on to say, Zelensky, the unelected dictator, better hurry up or he won't have a country left. Meanwhile, we are successfully negotiating with Russia to end the fight. Something everyone believes only Trump and the Trump administration can do. Biden hasn't even tried. Europe couldn't bring peace. And Zelensky likely wants to keep draining money from us.
So there's a lot to unpack there, but I think one of the key takeaways is that Trump is really hammering this idea that he and only he has the skills and the leverage to negotiate a successful peace deal with Russia.
Right. He's basically making Zelensky out to be the obstacle to peace, like the one who benefits from the war continuing.
Yeah, it's a very different image from the image that Zelensky has cultivated on the world stage, one of the courageous leader who's fighting for his country's survival.
Exactly. And it's important to remember that we're mainly hearing these claims from Trump and his supporters. So it's crucial to consider Zelensky's perspective too and the complexities of the situation before we jump to any conclusions.
Absolutely. There's always more to the story than what we see on the surface.
For sure. This whole situation really highlights just how challenging it is to try to pursue peace in the middle of a conflict that's still raging.
Yeah.
There are so many competing interests, and it's just incredibly difficult to find common ground when lives are on the line.
It's such a delicate balancing act. You've got the immediate need to stop the violence and protect civilians, but then at the same time, you have this long-term goal of achieving a peace that's actually just and lasting.
Right. And those two goals don't always line up neatly. Sometimes you have to make compromises in the short term to try to create a path towards a more sustainable peace down the road.
Exactly. And that's where things get really tricky, isn't it? Like, who gets to decide what compromises are acceptable, what concessions should be made, if any?
And how do you even ensure that those compromises don't end up undermining the very principles that you're fighting for in the first place? I mean, those are tough questions.
Incredibly tough. And there's no easy answer, no one-size-fits-all solution. Each conflict, it has its own unique dynamics, its own complexities.
But even with all that, I think it's important to keep in mind that peace is rarely achieved through military victory alone. I mean, ultimately, it requires dialogue, diplomacy, and a willingness to find some sort of common ground.
I completely agree. And that can be a really, really long and difficult process, especially when there's so much mistrust and animosity between the sides involved.
And it's interesting how Trump frames this whole thing. Like he's basically suggesting that Zelensky is intentionally dragging this war out, for his own benefit.
Right. Yeah, that's a big part of his argument. Like, he even says that Zelensky likely wants to keep draining money from us. So he's implying that Zelensky is somehow profiting from the war,
Yeah. And then he contrasts that with, his own supposed ability to just negotiate peace with Russia. Like, he says that everyone believes only Trump and the Trump administration can do it.
Yeah, which of course plays into that whole narrative he's been pushing about himself as like this master negotiator, the only one who can bring peace to these really complicated situations.
So basically, he's saying that if he were still in office, the war would already be over.
Pretty much, yeah. And I mean, it's a bold claim for sure, and it definitely resonates with some people, but it also raises some serious questions about, how realistic that actually is. I mean, what would the terms of such a peace deal even look like? What would Ukraine have to give up?
Right. What concessions would they have to make?
Exactly. And that's the thing we don't really know, because Trump's statements are pretty vague. He doesn't really get into specifics about, what a Trump brokered peace deal would actually entail. So it's important to be a little cautious about just accepting those claims at face value. I mean, we need to think about the potential consequences too.
Yeah. And we can't forget about Russia either, right? I mean, they have their own goals in this conflict, and they're probably not just going to, roll over and accept a peace deal that totally favors Ukraine or the West.
Yeah.
Any negotiation is going to involve some really tough compromises from everyone involved.
Absolutely. And navigating those compromises is going to require a deep understanding of, the whole geopolitical landscape, the historical context, all the different players and what their motivations are. It's definitely not as simple as just, sitting down with Putin and hashing out a deal.
Right. And this brings us back to, to that question about Ukraine's involvement in the peace talks.
Yeah.
Can you really achieve a lasting peace if they're not, directly involved?
That's the $1 million question, isn't it? And there are no easy answers. I mean, on the one hand, excluding Ukraine from those early stages of negotiation, it raises concerns about their agency, their ability to actually shape the outcome. And it plays into that whole, Russian narrative of trying to delegitimize the Ukrainian government.
But then some people would argue that, those direct talks between the U.S. and Russia are necessary as a first step, to de-escalate the situation and maybe lay the groundwork for some kind of, broader negotiation later on that would include Ukraine.
That's a valid point, too. And it's worth considering the potential benefits of that approach. I mean, that direct communication between the two superpowers, it could help to, to reduce misunderstandings, maybe establish some common ground and potentially, pave the way for a more inclusive process down the road.
So it's like we're stuck in this catch-22. If you exclude Ukraine, you risk undermining their sovereignty and their ability to, to get a peace deal that works for them. But if you involve them too early, it might make it harder to reach any agreement at all.
Exactly. That's the dilemma facing the international community right now. And there are no perfect solutions. Every approach has its own risks and rewards. It's a really delicate balancing act, and the stakes are incredibly high.
Yeah, it seems like the deeper we go into this, the more we realize that there are no easy answers. The path to peace in Ukraine, it's so much more complicated than it might seem at first glance.
For sure. I mean, we've talked about the peace talks, the debate over elections, and all the different ways that people are portraying Zelensky, as a hero versus a dictator.
And I think running through all of that is this question of agency. Who actually gets to decide the fate of Ukraine? Is it the Ukrainian people themselves? Is it their elected leaders? Is it the global superpowers, or is it some combination of all of the above?
And those are the questions that are really at the heart of this conflict. They force us to think about sovereignty and democracy and what it really means to pursue peace in a world that's, increasingly defined by these geopolitical rivalries and these constantly shifting power dynamics.
So where do we go from here? What are some of the scenarios that could actually play out in the coming months and years?
Well, that's what we'll explore next as we look at, some of the potential trajectories of this conflict, from a negotiated settlement to, the possibility of a protracted war with all the devastating consequences that would entail for Ukraine and for the rest of the world.
Okay, so things are about to get even more interesting. Stay with us as we continue our deep dive into the heart of the Ukraine conflict. All right, so we've talked about, the peace talks and the debate over elections and all the different ways people are looking at Zelensky's leadership.
Yeah.
But where do we go from here? Like, what are the actual paths forward in this conflict?
Well, that's the big question, isn't it? And unfortunately, nobody has a crystal ball to tell us exactly what's going to happen. But we can, we can look at some possible scenarios based on what we know so far.
Okay, so let's start with the most optimistic scenario. The best case outcome. What would a negotiated settlement look like in this situation?
Well, I think in the best case scenario, the U.S. and Russia would be able to find enough common ground in those preliminary talks, the ones without Ukraine, to at least create some kind of framework for a ceasefire. And then, hopefully a more inclusive negotiation process that would actually bring Ukraine to the table.
And what would those negotiations, what would they involve? What kind of things would each side have to give up?
Well, it would definitely be a complicated process. A lot of back and forth through Russia would probably demand certain security guarantees, like maybe Ukraine agreeing to stay neutral, not joining NATO, and maybe some limits on their military capabilities. And Ukraine would obviously insist on, maintaining their territorial integrity and getting all Russian forces out of their country.
So basically, a lot of give and take on both sides. But is that even realistic? Can they actually find a compromise that satisfies everybody's core interests?
That's the million-dollar question, right? It all comes down to whether the parties involved are actually willing to compromise, to move away from those maximalist positions and find a solution that addresses everybody's fundamental concerns.
And what if they can't? What if they're just not willing to budge on those core demands? What happens then?
Well, then we're looking at a much more pessimistic scenario, a war that just keeps dragging on for months or even years, which would be absolutely devastating for Ukraine and for the whole region.
So what would that look like practically? What would that kind of protracted war actually mean?
I mean, imagine a situation where the fighting just continues. Neither side can achieve a decisive victory. Cities continue to be destroyed. The death toll keeps rising, and the humanitarian crisis just gets worse and worse.
And that would have global implications too, right?
Absolutely. I mean, a prolonged conflict would definitely increase tensions between Russia and the West. It would fuel economic instability, and it could even draw other countries into the conflict, which would increase the risk of a wider war.
So yeah, that's a pretty catastrophic outcome, not just for Ukraine, but for the whole world.
Exactly. And that's why it's so important to keep exploring every possible avenue for a peaceful resolution, however difficult that might be, because the alternative is just too awful to even think about.
Yeah, that's a really sobering thought. It makes you realize just how high the stakes are here and how important it is to find a way to stop the violence, to break that cycle and move towards a more peaceful future.
And I think that's what we should all be hoping for and working towards, regardless of, our political views or our opinions on the specifics of this conflict. Peace has to be the ultimate goal.
Well said. I think that's a really powerful message to end on. Thanks so much for helping us understand this complex and confusing situation. I think our listeners will walk away with a much better grasp of the challenges and the potential paths forward in this conflict.
It's been my pleasure. I hope this deep dive will encourage people to, to really think critically about the information they're getting and to engage in some constructive conversations about how to achieve peace.
Absolutely. And if you want to stay informed and keep learning, be sure to subscribe to our podcast, available on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube. We're here to make things clear. New episodes every day.